Welcome back to another breaking legal analysis reporting video, ladies and gentlemen. Today's question we have is, what is an administrative stay when the Supreme Court issues it? Well, let's figure that out in today's legal breaking reporting and what it means. I'm gonna explore that with you guys today and break it down in today's legal breaking reporting. According to some research that I just did regarding administrative stays. Let's get into it. What is an administrative stay? An administrative stay, ladies and gentlemen, is when the Supreme Court issues an administrative stay. It's a temporary order suspending or halting the enforcement of a lower court's decision or action, allowing the court time to fully consider a request for expedited relief on or a motion for a stay pending appeal. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get a more detailed breakdown. Here's a more detailed breakdown, ladies and gentlemen. An administrative stay is a tool that is used by courts, including the Supreme Court, to temporarily halt ongoing federal legal proceedings, or the enforcement of a court order, allowing the court to make a more informed decision on a pending request for relief. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear what a more detailed breakdown of it means. Ladies and gentlemen, a more detailed breakdown of what it means is that it's often used when a party seeks to prevent a lower court's decision from taking effect. Ladies and gentlemen, in this case, the party is the corrupt, illegal administration of Donald Trump. While they pursue an appeal or other legal remedies. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to figure out what the duration would be. Ladies and gentlemen, the duration definition means an administrative stays. Administrative stays are intended to be temporary, lasting only as long as necessary for the court to make a decision on the merits of the case or the request for a stay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now about to look at some examples. Some examples, ladies and gentlemen, might include: a state could prevent a government agency from enforcing regulation while a case challenging it is pending. It could, ladies and gentlemen, halt the execution of a sentence while an appeal is being considered. It could prevent a company from implementing a decision while a lawsuit is pending. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to look at the standard definition. Ladies and gentlemen, the legal standard for granting a stay includes demonstrating a reasonable probability that the Supreme Court will grant a certiorari, a fair prospect that the court will reverse the decision below, and a likelihood that irreparable harm will consider from the denial of a stay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to look at the impact. Ladies and gentlemen, administrative stays can have a significant practical consequences, potentially affecting lives, policies, and the status quo in the area where the stay applies. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get into the federal courts section. The federal courts have not endorsed a uniform standard for determining whether a stay or an administrative stay is warranted. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get into right now what an administrative stay means when the United States Supreme Court issues one. Ladies and gentlemen, when the United States Supreme Court issues an administrative stay, it's a temporary measure keyword, ladies and gentlemen, temporary measure, does not mean that it's permanent. It's just a temporary restraining order that's considered an administrative stay by the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts has already issued one in the past, and yet the Trump administration lost when an administrative stay was issued in the past on the merits that they were trying to win from the Supreme Court in the past. A pause in a legal proceeding or action to allow the court time to consider a request for a stay pending appeal or other decision without making a final decision on the merits of the case. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear another more detailed breakdown. Ladies and gentlemen, an administrative stay is a temporary measure used by the Supreme Court to halt a lower court's order or action allowing the court to consider a request for a stay pending appeal or other legal matter. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear the purpose, as well as the heading that it is not yet considered a final ruling. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose. For the administrative stay is that it allows the Supreme Court to consider a request for a stay pending appeal, which is a request to halt the enforcement of a lower court's decision while the case is being appealed. Not a final ruling, ladies and gentlemen. An administrative stay is not a ruling on the merits of the case and doesn't indicate how the court might eventually rule. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear a few other more examples. Ladies and gentlemen, in a recent case, the Supreme Court issued an administrative stay to delay the return of a man who was wrongly deported, giving the court time to consider the matter. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear the significance and get into the significance. Spider-Man, let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, administrative stays can have real-world consequences, as seen in high-profile cases involving immigration and abortion. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to find out the no uniform standard. Ladies and gentlemen, the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, haven't established a uniform standard for determining when an administrative stay is warranted. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear some considerations. Ladies and gentlemen, when deciding whether to grant an administrative stay, courts consider factors like likelihood of irreparable harm if the stay is denied, the applicant's chances of success on appeal, and the equities of the case. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get into the temporary nature of the administrative stay and figure out and find out what that means. ladies and gentlemen, the administrative stays are typically temporary, designed to buy time for the court to consider the matter, not to make a final determination. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude it for today's legal breaking analysis reporting video on what an administrative stay is, among other things, and what it means when the Supreme Court of the United States issues an administrative stay. Like I said, they've done so already in the past against the Trump administration, and then the Trump administration already lost when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court issued temporary administrative stay in the past. That is going to conclude it for today's legal breaking analysis reporting, ladies and gentlemen. If you did enjoy this legal breaking analysis reporting, please do consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. A couple of ways you guys can stay up to date if you want to make sure that you never miss a brand new legal breaking reporting and legal breaking analysis video. One is by hitting the bell icon that does not cost anything. It is located directly below the screen here on the right hand side of the subscribe button. Another way you guys can stay up to date and make sure you never miss brand new legal breaking reporting is by following me on my social medias that I will have linked down below in the video description. I am on Instagram, Snapchat, Threads, and Threads, as well as TikTok. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I had to think about that for a second. Thirdly, and second to last, please help me reach the overall channel goal of 150 plus subscribers. The reason why I'm saying 150 plus subscribers, ladies and gentlemen, is because right after we reach and achieve the goal of 150 subscribers, we have more subscribers to achieve and reach right after we reach the goal of 150 subscribers. Until my next illegal breaking reporting, ladies and gentlemen, please stay safe, please stay positive, and know that justice will prevail on the correct side of the law, despite Donald Trump and his illegal administration and his, as well as their unconstitutional efforts and decisions and executive orders.